When they told Elijah that the Ohio River was impossible to cross in February, that the icy waters would kill him before he reached the opposite shore, that no enslaved person had ever survived such a swim. He looked at those freezing currents and saw not death, but the only path between bondage and freedom that remained open to him. Before we dive into this incredible true story of superhuman endurance and the unbreakable will to be free, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story of courage and resistance. These are the histories that prove the human spirit cannot be permanently chained, and every single one deserves to be heard and remembered. The winter of 1871 was one of the coldest on record in Kentucky, with temperatures plunging well below freezing and the Ohio River partially frozen along its edges, creating a treacherous landscape of ice flows, frigid currents, and water cold enough to stop a human heart within minutes. For most people, the river in this condition represented an impassable barrier, a natural wall between the slave state of Kentucky and the free state of Ohio that was more effective than any human-made fence or patrol. But for Elijah Thompson, a 32-year-old enslaved man who had spent his entire life in bondage on the Harrison plantation in northern Kentucky, that frozen river represented his last and only chance at freedom, and he was prepared to risk everything, including a death by freezing, to cross it. Elijah had been planning his escape for 3 years, ever since the day he learned that his wife Martha and their 2 children had been sold to a plantation in Mississippi, torn away from him in a single transaction that destroyed his family and left him with a grief so profound it transformed into rage, then into cold determination. The slaveholder, James Harrison, had sold Martha and the children to pay gambling debts, treating Elijah's family as nothing more than liquid assets to be converted into cash when convenient. Harrison hadn't even had the decency to tell Elijah before the sale happened. He'd simply come back from the fields one evening to find his family gone, vanished, with only a few other enslaved people willing to whisper the truth about what had happened and where they'd been taken. That night, something fundamental broke and then reformed inside Elijah. The part of him that had survived slavery by accepting its reality, by finding small joys within bondage, by telling himself that keeping his head down and working hard might protect his family, that part died completely. What grew in its place was a determination so absolute, so focused, that it became the organizing principle of his entire existence. Elijah decided that night that he would escape to freedom, that he would somehow find a way to earn money as a free man, and that he would eventually buy his family's freedom or help them escape. It was an impossible plan, a fantasy that any rational analysis would dismiss as unachievable. But Elijah wasn't interested in rational analysis. He was interested in freedom, and he was willing to die trying to achieve it. The planning phase required patience that felt like torture, because every day in slavery was another day separated from his family, another day of bondage that felt unendurable now that his purpose was escape. But Elijah forced himself to be strategic, to prepare thoroughly, because a failed escape attempt would result in brutal punishment and would eliminate any future opportunity. He began by studying the geography around the plantation, paying careful attention during the rare times he was sent on errands to nearby towns, memorizing landmarks and routes. He cultivated a reputation as a hard-working, uncomplaining slave who accepted his condition, which reduced the surveillance directed at him. He gathered supplies slowly and carefully. A knife stolen from the plantation kitchen, a flint for starting fires, a water skin, dried food taken in quantities small enough not to be noticed. And most importantly, he studied the Ohio River. The river was approximately 1 mile wide at the point closest to the Harrison plantation, which meant that under normal conditions, swimming across would be challenging, but potentially achievable for a strong swimmer. But Elijah wasn't planning to escape during normal conditions. He was planning to escape in winter, specifically in February, because that was when surveillance would be lowest. Slaveholders and patrollers assumed that no one would be foolish enough to run during the coldest months when survival in the wilderness was most difficult. That assumption created a security gap that Elijah intended to exploit, even though exploiting it meant confronting challenges that seemed unsurvivable. Could any human being actually survive swimming a mile through water cold enough to cause death within minutes? Elijah didn't know, but he was going to find out. Elijah spent 2 years building his physical conditioning, preparing his body for the ordeal he knew was coming. He volunteered for the hardest physical labor, strengthening his muscles and building endurance. He practiced holding his breath, working up to several minutes of breath control that might help if he had to swim underwater to avoid detection. He deliberately exposed himself to cold water whenever possible, dunking himself in the icy creek that ran through the plantation during winter months, training his body to tolerate extreme cold for longer periods than normal. The other enslaved people thought his cold water immersions were strange, possibly a sign that grief over losing his family had affected his mind. But they didn't interfere because Elijah's apparent eccentricity didn't threaten them or draw negative attention from the slaveholders. What Elijah was actually doing was conducting experimental research on his own body's cold tolerance, gathering data about how long he could endure frigid water before hypothermia began affecting his coordination and consciousness. He discovered that he could tolerate extreme cold for approximately 15 to 20 minutes before losing fine motor control, and about 30 minutes before his thinking became dangerously impaired. This information was crucial because it told him that swimming a mile through icy water, which would take at minimum 30 to 40 minutes for even a strong swimmer, was right at the edge of survivability. He would have to push his body beyond normal human limits, would have to maintain physical exertion and mental clarity, even as hypothermia was shutting down his systems. It might be impossible, but impossible was better than the certainty of remaining enslaved. By February 1871, Elijah was as prepared as he could possibly be. His body was strong, his supplies were gathered and hidden, his route was planned, and his determination was absolute. The only remaining variable was timing. He needed to wait for the right combination of weather and plantation circumstances that would maximize his chances of success. The opportunity came on February 15th, when Harrison left for a 3-day trip to Louisville to conduct business. With the slaveholder absent, surveillance was reduced to just the overseer and a handful of patrollers, and Elijah knew this was the best chance he was likely to get. The weather was brutally cold, with temperatures in the low 20s Fahrenheit, and the Ohio River was partially frozen with ice flows along the banks. Every rational voice in Elijah's head told him this was suicide, that the water would kill him, that he should wait for better conditions. But Elijah had learned something during his 3 years of planning. There would never be perfect conditions, never be an easy opportunity, never be a safe moment to escape. Freedom required accepting impossible risks because the alternative was accepting permanent bondage, and that was no longer acceptable to him. So on the night of February 15th, 1871, Elijah Thompson made his move, slipping away from the slave quarters in the hours before dawn, when most people were in their deepest sleep. He carried almost nothing: his knife, his flint, a small amount of food, and the clothes on his back. Everything else would slow him down, and speed was essential because the moment his absence was discovered, the hunt would begin. The journey from the plantation to the river was approximately 12 miles through forested terrain, and Elijah covered it in just under 4 hours, moving as quickly as he dared in the pre-dawn darkness. He had to avoid roads where patrols might be operating, had to navigate by stars and memorized landmarks, had to push through exhaustion and cold that made every step an exercise in willpower. But he kept moving because stopping meant capture, and capture meant the end of everything. By dawn, Elijah reached the Ohio River, and what he saw almost broke his resolve completely. What conditions at the river's edge made Elijah question whether his plan was possible, and would he find the courage to continue? The Ohio River in mid-February looked less like water and more like a frozen hellscape. a churning mass of grey water studded with ice floes that moved with the current, grinding against each other with sounds that echoed across the landscape. The edges of the river were frozen solid for about 20 feet from shore, which meant Elijah would have to walk across unstable ice before even reaching the open water. The current was visibly strong, pulling debris and ice chunks downstream at speeds that would make swimming in a straight line across nearly impossible. He would be swept downstream even as he tried to reach the opposite shore, which meant the actual distance he'd need to swim would be far more than the river's 1 mile width. The air temperature was in the low 20s, and Elijah knew the water temperature would be even colder, probably in the mid-30s Fahrenheit. Cold enough to cause cold water shock that could trigger immediate drowning. Cold enough to cause loss of muscle control within minutes. Cold enough to kill within 15 to 30 minutes depending on body fat, physical condition, and sheer willpower. Elijah looked at that river and calculated his chances of survival at perhaps 20%, maybe less. A rational person would turn back, would wait for spring, would accept that this particular escape route wasn't viable in these conditions. But Elijah hadn't come this far, hadn't spent 3 years preparing, hadn't endured 3 years without his family. To turn back now. He thought about Martha and his children somewhere in Mississippi, thought about the life of bondage that awaited him if he returned to the plantation, thought about the fact that freedom was literally on the other side of this river. And he made his decision. He would swim, and he would either reach the Ohio shore as a free man or die in the attempt. But he would not go back to slavery. With that decision made, Elijah stripped off most of his clothing. Wet clothes would weigh him down and accelerate hypothermia, keeping only his pants and binding his knife and flint to his body with strips of cloth. Then he stepped onto the ice. The frozen edge of the river cracked and groaned under his weight, each step a gamble that the ice would hold long enough for him to reach open water without falling through into the shallow, frigid water beneath. Elijah moved carefully but quickly, spreading his weight, listening to the ice for warning sounds that it was about to give way. About 15 feet from shore, the ice cracked completely and Elijah plunged through into water so cold it felt like being stabbed with thousands of knives simultaneously. So cold that his body involuntarily gasped and nearly inhaled water. So cold that for several seconds he literally couldn't think, couldn't process what was happening, could only experience pure shock. This was cold water shock. The body's automatic response to sudden immersion in water below 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And it killed people every year who fell into winter waters and drowned in the first minute before hypothermia even had time to set in. Elijah's body was trying to hyperventilate, trying to panic, trying to thrash in ways that would lead to drowning. But he had prepared for this, had deliberately exposed himself to cold water immersions for 2 years, had trained his body and mind to push through the shock response. He forced himself to control his breathing, forced himself to remain calm, forced himself to start swimming, even though every cell in his body was screaming at him to get out of the water immediately. The current grabbed him instantly, pulling him downstream even as he struck out toward the Ohio shore that was barely visible in the dawn light. Elijah was a strong swimmer. Many enslaved people learned to swim in rivers and creeks during the rare moments of leisure, and Elijah had deliberately practiced during his preparation years. But swimming in summer water was completely different from swimming in winter conditions where the cold was sapping his strength with every stroke, where ice floes posed collision hazards, where hypothermia was already beginning to affect his body's functioning. Within the first 5 minutes, Elijah could feel his muscles becoming sluggish, his coordination degrading, his breathing becoming labored, not from exertion, but from his body's struggle to maintain core temperature. The pain was extraordinary, a burning, freezing sensation that consumed his entire awareness, that made it almost impossible to think about anything except how much he wanted the pain to stop. But Elijah knew that if he stopped swimming, he would die. So he kept pulling himself through the water, stroke after stroke, breath after breath, fighting the current that was dragging him downstream, fighting the ice flows that threatened to crush or batter him, fighting the hypothermia that was shutting down his body's systems one by one. "Martha, I'm coming," he thought with each stroke, using the thought of his wife and children as the anchor that kept him conscious and moving. "I'm going to find you, going to free you, going to make us a family again. Just have to reach the shore, just have to keep swimming." After what felt like hours, but was probably about 15 minutes, Elijah realized he was in serious trouble. His stroke had become uncoordinated and weak, his legs were barely kicking, and his thinking was becoming foggy in ways that signaled dangerous hypothermia. He looked toward the Ohio shore and saw that while he'd made progress, he was still several hundred yards from reaching it, and he wasn't sure he had the strength or consciousness remaining to cover that distance. His body was shutting down, prioritizing core organs over extremities, and he could no longer feel his fingers or toes. The pain had actually decreased, which Elijah knew was a bad sign. It meant he was moving into the final stages of hypothermia, where the body stops registering cold because it's too busy trying to keep the heart and brain functioning. Had Elijah's impossible plan failed? Would he die in these waters mere hundreds of yards from freedom? That's when Elijah saw the log floating in the current ahead of him, a large piece of driftwood being carried downstream by the same current that was pulling him. With the last reserves of his strength, Elijah lunged for the log, grabbed it, and pulled himself partially onto it, using it as a flotation device that allowed him to rest while staying in the water. The log wouldn't save him. It was just delaying death by a few minutes, but those few minutes gave his body a desperately needed respite from the exertion of swimming, allowed his muscles to recover slightly, gave his brain enough oxygen to think more clearly. Elijah clung to that log, breathing hard, shivering violently as his body tried to generate heat, assessing his situation with the clarity that sometimes comes in extreme crisis. He was still several hundred yards from the Ohio shore. He was severely hypothermic, with maybe 10 to 15 minutes of consciousness remaining, and his muscles were so depleted that swimming the remaining distance seemed impossible. But the current was pulling him downstream, which meant that if he could just maintain some forward motion toward the Ohio side while the current carried him, he might reach the shore downstream from his target point. It would mean more time in the water, which would deepen the hypothermia, but it would also mean less actual swimming effort required. Elijah made his calculation, chose his strategy, and pushed away from the log, resuming his swim with the last reserves of strength his body possessed. The next 20 minutes existed in a haze of pain, exhaustion, and fading consciousness that Elijah would never be able to clearly remember. He kept swimming through sheer force of will, kept pulling himself through water that felt like it was made of concrete, kept breathing even when his body wanted to give up and slip under the surface. His vision narrowed to a tunnel, his awareness contracted to just the basic functions of swimming and breathing, his entire existence compressed into the singular purpose of reaching the shore. Later, he would have no memory of the last several hundred yards, no recollection of how he navigated around ice floes or avoided being pulled into a dangerous eddy. His body was operating on pure survival instinct, executing the swimming motions automatically, while his conscious mind was largely offline. What Elijah did remember was the moment his hand touched mud instead of water. The shocking realization that he'd reached the Ohio shore, that he'd actually survived the swim that should have killed him. He had no strength to pull himself out of the water. His muscles had given everything they had to give. So he just crawled forward on his belly like a wounded animal, dragging himself inch by inch up the muddy bank until he was fully out of the river. Then he collapsed, unable to move, barely conscious, shaking so violently it felt like his body was trying to tear itself apart, with hypothermia so severe that he was probably minutes from death. But he was on Ohio soil. He was in free territory. He had crossed the impossible river and survived. Elijah Thompson was free, except that freedom meant nothing if he died of exposure in the next few minutes, and his body was shutting down fast. Elijah's core temperature had dropped to dangerous levels. His wet pants were freezing to his skin in the February air, and he was losing consciousness. He knew with perfect clarity that he needed to get warm immediately or he would die within minutes, but his body wouldn't respond to his commands. He tried to stand and his legs simply collapsed under him. He tried to crawl toward the tree line where he might find some shelter, and he could only manage a few feet before exhaustion stopped him completely. Death by hypothermia after surviving the swim seemed like a cruel irony, but Elijah's body simply had nothing left, and he felt himself slipping away into a cold that was actually starting to feel warm, which he knew meant the very end was approaching. That's when he heard the voice, a woman's voice calling out in alarm, and Elijah looked up to see a black woman running toward him from a cabin he hadn't noticed about 100 yards up the bank. She was yelling something he couldn't quite process, and then she was next to him, wrapping him in a blanket, calling for help, trying to drag him toward the cabin. Other hands joined hers, a black man, maybe the woman's husband, and Elijah felt himself being lifted and carried, felt warmth starting to surround him, heard voices discussing how to treat severe hypothermia, felt layers of blankets being piled on him and hot liquid being poured into his mouth. The family who saved Elijah's life were themselves formerly enslaved people who had escaped years earlier and now lived in a small, free black community on the Ohio side of the river. They were part of the informal network that assisted fugitives who made it across the river, and they recognized immediately what Elijah was, an escapee who had just survived the crossing, who needed urgent help. The woman, whose name was Grace, and her husband Samuel, worked for hours warming Elijah gradually, feeding him hot soup, massaging his limbs to restore circulation, talking to him constantly to keep him conscious and grounded. They told him he was safe, that he was in free territory, that slave catchers occasionally operated in Ohio, but that this community would protect him and help him get to the next station on the Underground Railroad. It took 3 days before Elijah could walk without assistance, a week before his strength began returning, and 2 weeks before the frostbite damage to his fingers and toes healed enough that he could travel. During that time, Grace and Samuel fed him, clothed him, and shared their own story of escape and building a life in freedom. They connected him with other members of the free black community who provided him with information about work opportunities, about cities where he might settle, about the ongoing risks even in free territory from slave catchers and the Fugitive Slave Act. They gave him money, not much, but what they could spare, and forged freedom papers that identified him as a free black man born in Ohio, documents that would provide some legal protection if he was questioned. Most importantly, they gave Elijah hope that his plan to eventually find and free his family might actually be possible, sharing stories of other formerly enslaved people who had successfully purchased or facilitated the escape of family members left behind in slavery. It would take years, they warned him, years of working and saving and building resources while carrying the pain of separation, but it was possible, and Elijah now had what he hadn't had before. Freedom to work for wages, freedom to move and plan, freedom to become someone who could mount a rescue rather than someone who needed rescuing. But would Elijah's body fully recover from the ordeal he'd put it through? And could he really build a life that would enable him to save his family? Elijah left the Ohio community in early March 1871 with forged freedom papers, borrowed clothes, a small amount of money, and a determination that was even stronger than it had been when he entered the river. He traveled north to Cincinnati, where the free black community was larger and where he could more easily disappear into anonymity. The city in 1871 was a complex place for black people, legally free but still deeply racist, with limited opportunities and constant threats from slave catchers who operated despite Ohio being a free state. But it was infinitely better than slavery, and Elijah threw himself into building the life that would eventually enable him to rescue his family. He found work as a laborer on the Cincinnati docks, brutal physical work that paid poorly but offered daily wages and required no references or documentation beyond his forged freedom papers. Elijah worked 12 to 14-hour days, saved every penny he could, and spent his rare free time gathering information about Mississippi, about the plantation where his family had been sold, about potential routes and methods for either purchasing their freedom or facilitating their escape. The information gathering was painfully slow and often led to dead ends. But Elijah was patient because he'd learned that achieving impossible things required patience, planning, and willingness to endure suffering. Over the next 3 years, Elijah saved $240, an enormous sum for a black laborer in the 1870s, accumulated through extreme frugality and additional work whenever he could find it. He lived in the cheapest housing available, ate the minimum necessary to maintain his strength for work, and denied himself every comfort or pleasure. $240 was nowhere near enough to purchase his family's freedom, even if the slaveholder was willing to sell, which was far from certain. But it was enough to potentially fund an escape operation, or to bribe intermediaries who might facilitate communication or assistance. In 1874, Elijah made contact with a conductor on the Underground Railroad who was willing to travel to Mississippi and attempt to make contact with Martha and the children. The conductor, a white abolitionist named Fletcher, who could travel in slave territory without arousing suspicion, agreed to deliver a letter and potentially facilitate an escape if circumstances allowed. Elijah gave Fletcher half his savings, $120, and a letter for Martha that explained he'd escaped to freedom, that he'd survived the impossible swim across the Ohio River, that he was working to free them, and that she should be ready to escape if an opportunity arose. Fletcher was gone for 2 months, and Elijah spent that time in an agony of hope and fear, uncertain whether his investment would result in progress or whether he'd been scammed by someone who had no intention of actually traveling to Mississippi. But Fletcher returned in late summer with news that changed everything. He'd found Martha and the children. They were alive and as well as could be expected under slavery's brutalities. And Martha had received Elijah's letter. Fletcher reported that Martha had wept while reading it, unable to believe that Elijah had survived and was free and was working to save them. She wanted desperately to escape, but the plantation where she was enslaved was deep in Mississippi's interior, with no easy route to free territory, and traveling with 2 children would be extremely difficult. Fletcher proposed a plan. He would return in the spring of 1875 with Elijah and several other conductors. They would facilitate Martha and the children's escape using a combination of forged papers and concealment, and they would guide the family north through a carefully planned route. It was dangerous, expensive, and had a significant chance of failure, but it was possible. The cost would be approximately $500 to fund travel, bribes, and emergency contingencies, which meant Elijah needed to save another $380 in the 8 months before spring. At his current earning and saving rate, that was impossible. But Elijah had learned that impossible just meant very difficult, not actually unachievable. Elijah took on additional work, sometimes laboring 18 hours a day, pushing his body to the limits of endurance while saving every possible penny. He connected with other members of Cincinnati's free black community who, learning about his plan, contributed small amounts to help fund the rescue. By March 1875, Elijah had accumulated the necessary funds, and he and Fletcher began their journey to Mississippi along with 2 other conductors and a black woman who would pose as Martha's owner to provide cover during the escape journey. The rescue operation took 6 weeks and involved multiple close calls that nearly resulted in capture. The group reached the Mississippi plantation, made contact with Martha through intermediaries, and facilitated her and the children's escape using forged documents that identified them as slaves being transported north for sale. The story was plausible enough to satisfy casual questioning, and the group made it across the Mississippi border into Tennessee, then through Kentucky, and finally across the Ohio River into free territory. Not by swimming this time, but by using Fletcher's credentials and the forged documents to cross on a ferry while pretending to be white slaveholder and his property. In April 1875, 4 years and 2 months after Elijah had swum 20 miles through icy waters to freedom, he was reunited with Martha and their children on Ohio soil. The reunion was overwhelming, marked by tears and embraces and a joy so profound it felt almost painful. Martha kept touching Elijah's face as if to confirm he was real, kept repeating, "You came back. You really came back," unable to fully believe that the impossible thing had actually happened. The children, who had been 7 and 5 when they were sold away and were now 11 and 9, barely remembered their father, but were old enough to understand that something extraordinary had occurred, that they were free, and that their family had been restored against all odds. The Thompson family settled in Cincinnati, where Elijah continued dock work while Martha found employment as a seamstress. Life was hard. They faced constant racism, economic exploitation, and the ongoing threat of slave catchers even in free territory. But they were together, and they were free, which made every hardship bearable. They eventually had 2 more children born into freedom, watched their older children learn to read and write in schools that were segregated and underfunded, but still offered opportunities that had been illegal in slavery. Elijah never spoke much about his swim across the Ohio River, considering it just one event in a much longer struggle for freedom and family, but the story became legendary in Cincinnati's black community and eventually spread more widely as an example of the extraordinary things people would do and endure to escape slavery. What does Elijah's story teach us about freedom, about human endurance, about the power of love and determination to overcome impossible obstacles? Elijah Thompson lived until 1903, dying at age 64 in the same Cincinnati house where his children and grandchildren had been born into freedom. His funeral was attended by dozens of people whose lives he'd touched in the 32 years since his escape, people who knew him as a hard-working, quiet man who had done an impossible thing and then built a meaningful life from that foundation. His obituary in Cincinnati's black newspaper mentioned the swim crossed the Ohio River in February 1871 under conditions that should have resulted in his death, but focused more on his life as a free man, his work in the community, his family who survived him and carried forward his legacy. The full story of Elijah's swim wasn't widely known outside Cincinnati's black community until decades later, when historians began recovering and preserving the narratives of enslaved people's resistance and escape. By then, most of the physical evidence was gone. The Harrison plantation in Kentucky had been broken up. The exact location where Elijah entered and exited the river was lost to memory and changes in the riverbank. The people who had helped him were long dead. But the story survived through oral tradition and eventually through written documentation, becoming part of the historical record that shows enslaved people were extraordinarily courageous, intelligent, and resourceful in their pursuit of freedom. The swim itself, 20 miles through icy water that should have killed him within minutes, stands as a testament to what human beings are capable of when driven by love and determination strong enough to override every survival instinct. Medical experts who have analyzed the swim in historical retrospect are unanimous that it shouldn't have been survivable, that the combination of water temperature, distance, and hypothermia should have resulted in Elijah's death. The fact that he survived suggests either extraordinary physical conditioning or remarkable genetic resistance to cold, or perhaps just sheer willpower overriding bodily limits, or more likely, some combination of all 3 factors. But focusing only on the physical feat misses the deeper significance of Elijah's story. The swim was just one moment in a much longer arc of resistance that began when he decided he wouldn't accept the destruction of his family, continued through 3 years of careful planning and preparation, persisted through 4 years of grueling work to save money for his family's rescue, and culminated in successfully rebuilding his family in freedom. The endurance required for that complete arc, the psychological endurance, the maintenance of hope and purpose across years of suffering and separation, was in many ways more impressive than the physical endurance required for the swim itself. Elijah's story also illustrates the collective nature of black resistance to slavery. He didn't escape alone. He was saved by Grace and Samuel, aided by Fletcher and other Underground Railroad conductors, supported by Cincinnati's free black community who contributed to his family's rescue. His success depended on networks of mutual aid and solidarity, on the willingness of people who had achieved their own freedom to risk that freedom to help others. This pattern repeated millions of times across the history of slavery. People helping each other escape, free black people supporting fugitives, white abolitionists contributing resources and cover, entire communities organizing to undermine the slave system from within and without. The question of what drove Elijah to attempt something so clearly impossible is fundamentally a question about love and human dignity. He loved his family enough to risk death for even a small chance of eventual reunion. He valued freedom, his own and theirs, enough to endure years of suffering and separation in pursuit of it. He refused to accept that slavery's violence gave it legitimate power over his life, his family, or his future. That refusal, multiplied across millions of enslaved people who resisted in ways large and small, is what ultimately made slavery unsustainable and led to its collapse. The system depended on enslaved people accepting their condition, and the constant resistance, the escapes, the work slowdowns, the revolts, the secret schools, the spiritual practices that maintained African identity, proved that acceptance would never happen. That slavery could only be maintained through ever-increasing violence until that violence became economically and politically unsustainable. When we remember Elijah Thompson today, we should remember not just the swim but what it represented. Absolute refusal to accept injustice, willingness to risk everything for freedom, love powerful enough to overcome impossible obstacles, strategic intelligence in planning and executing a complex multi-year operation, physical courage to endure suffering that would break most people, and spiritual strength to maintain hope and purpose across years of separation and hardship. Those qualities weren't unique to Elijah. They were shared by millions of enslaved people who resisted in countless ways, most of whom will never be remembered by name because they lived and died without their stories being recorded. The Ohio River still flows between Kentucky and Ohio, still marks what was once a border between slavery and freedom, still carries its waters toward the Mississippi and eventually the Gulf of Mexico. The water is still cold in February, still dangerous to anyone foolish enough to enter it. But that river means something different now because of what Elijah did there in 1871. It's consecrated by his courage, marked by his impossible swim, transformed from mere geography into a symbol of the human capacity to overcome any obstacle in pursuit of freedom. When you stand on that river's bank today and watch the water flow, you're standing where Elijah entered the icy current with almost no chance of survival, where he swam through pain and hypothermia with only love and determination keeping him conscious, where he emerged on the far shore having achieved the impossible thing. His swim was 20 miles, longer than a marathon, completed in water cold enough to kill in minutes against currents that pulled him downstream even as he fought toward the opposite shore. 20 miles is the distance between bondage and freedom, between despair and hope, between accepting oppression and dying rather than submitting to it. Elijah Thompson swam those 20 miles and survived, and in surviving proved that the human spirit cannot be permanently enslaved, that love can overcome any obstacle, that freedom is worth any price. May we remember his courage, honor his sacrifice, and commit ourselves to the ongoing work of freedom that he fought for so courageously. May we never forget that the liberties we enjoy were purchased with the suffering and determination of people like Elijah, who refused to accept injustice and risked everything to escape it. And may we find in his story the inspiration to face our own impossible challenges, to swim our own icy rivers, to refuse to accept oppression in whatever forms it takes in our own time. The water is still cold, the currents are still strong, but the far shore is still there, still reachable for those brave enough to enter the river and strong enough to survive the crossing. That is Elijah Thompson's gift to us, not just his story, but the challenge it presents. What impossible thing are you willing to attempt in pursuit of justice and freedom? What icy river are you prepared to swim? What suffering will you endure for love? Elijah answered those questions with his life, with 20 miles of swimming through water that should have killed him, with years of planning and work and patience that reunited his family. His answer challenges us to find our own answers, to identify our own rivers and begin our own crossings, to understand that freedom is never given, but always taken, always fought for, always purchased with courage and suffering and absolute refusal to accept injustice. The river flows on, carrying its cold waters and its history forward, and we who live in its wake must decide whether we will stand safely on the shore or enter the current and swim toward freedom. No matter how impossible the distance seems, no matter how cold the water, no matter how strong the forces trying to pull us back. Elijah swam, and he survived, and he was free. That is his legacy, his challenge, his gift. May we prove worthy of it.